My name is Serena DuPont Graves, and if you think you know my story, you don't. You've heard bits and pieces, the rumors, the whispers, the tabloid half-truths that circulated through the country clubs of Buckhead, Atlanta like cheap wine at a five-star event. People love to talk about a woman who fought back. What they don't tell you is what she had to survive first. I was 34 when I married into the Graves family. Not a name you'd necessarily recognize unless you run in circles where the guest lists are hand-delivered and the zip codes start with 3. Fitzgerald Graves, Fitz to everyone who wanted something from him, was old Georgia money wrapped in a new tech fortune. His family had been in Atlanta real estate since before the city rebuilt itself after the Civil War, and Fitz had taken that inheritance and tripled it through a software firm that handled government contracts so quietly, so efficiently, that nobody ever asked too many questions. I asked questions. That was always my problem. We met at a charity auction for children's literacy in Midtown. He was bidding on a weekend in Aspen. I was there as a junior partner at Hollowell & Reed, the law firm where I'd clawed my way up for 9 years without a single safety net. No family money, no legacy admission, no one greasing the wheels. Just me, my brain, and a stubbornness that my late grandmother used to call God-given grit. Fitz told me later that he noticed me before I opened my mouth, that I carried myself like I owned the room, even though I'd just paid the valet with a credit card I was praying had a room on it. I told him that was the best lie I'd ever heard. He laughed so hard his bourbon sloshed. That was the beginning. We dated for 2 years, married in a ceremony at his family's estate in Dunwoody, a property so vast that the rehearsal dinner alone had 140 guests. I wore ivory because I liked ivory. His mother, Paulette Graves, wore cream to the wedding and called it a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. That was my first lesson in how the Graves family fought. Quietly, precisely, with just enough plausible deniability to make you question your own sanity. I should have paid better attention. But I was 34, and I was in love. And sometimes love makes you want to believe the best version of the story. So I moved into the Dunwoody house, kept my name hyphenated over Fitz's mild objection, made partner at Hollowell & Reed by 36, and told myself that the coldness I occasionally caught in Paulette's eyes when she looked at me was just her default setting, that the way Fitz's sister, Blythe, would go quiet whenever I entered a room was just shyness, that the family was simply reserved, private, Old South in the way that meant manners at the table and silence about everything else. Then we adopted Zara. She was 14 months old when we brought her home. Born in Savannah, relinquished at birth, spent her first year in a foster placement that loved her but couldn't keep her. The day I held her for the first time in the DHS office on Bull Street, she grabbed my thumb with both hands and looked up at me with these enormous dark eyes, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I have never been able to describe adequately to anyone. It wasn't sudden. It was tectonic, like something that had been missing for years finally locked into place. Zara was black. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because the simplicity of it is deceptive. Zara was black, and Fitz and I are white, and in a just world, that would be the least interesting sentence in this entire story. In the world I was actually living in, inside a wealthy, insular, predominantly white social circle in Buckhead, it became the sentence that unraveled everything. Fitz had agreed to adopt. He'd been the one who suggested it, actually, after 2 years of trying and 2 devastating miscarriages that left me hollowed out in ways I'm still finding. We'd talked about domestic adoption, about transracial adoption specifically, about the research and the responsibility and the cultural humility required. I'd read every book, joined every support group, spoken to parents in similar families. I thought Fitz was with me, all the way, genuinely. And for the first few months he was, or he performed it convincingly enough that I couldn't find the seam. The first crack appeared at Paulette's annual July 4th party. Paulette looked at Zara. The smile that crossed her face was the most expansive lie I'd ever seen. Warm enough to pass, empty enough if you knew where to look, to chill your blood. "Well," she said in that magnolia sweet drawl she deployed like a weapon, Aren't you just something? Not beautiful, not precious, something. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I told myself this for the next 6 months while the microaggressions stacked up like unpaid bills. Blythe asking at Thanksgiving whether we thought about what happens when she gets older and starts asking questions about where she comes from, her voice carrying this performative concern that was really just a wish for complications. Paulette's bridge club friends who would comment on Zara's exotic features and then look at me for a reaction. Fishing. The way the family suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever I suggested bringing Zara to gatherings. The way Fitz started showing up to those gatherings alone and then coming home smelling like someone else's perfume, but that was a separate disaster I wasn't ready to name yet. The thing that broke the dam wasn't one of the adults. It was a child's birthday party. Paulette threw a birthday party for Blythe's daughter, Cassidy, who was turning 5. It was held at their country club in Buckhead, the kind of place where the membership fees are not listed on any website because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. I brought Zara, who was 2 by then, bright and curious and fearless the way 2-year-olds are before the world teaches them to be afraid. There were maybe 15 children there, all from the same neighborhood, the same schools, the same world. Zara walked up to a cluster of kids near the bounce house. A little girl, 7 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a monogram dress, looked at Zara and said, loud enough for multiple adults to hear, "Why does she look like that? Mama said people like her don't belong here." The adults heard. Nobody said a word. Not one. I heard it. I watched the faces. I watched Paulette's almost imperceptible nod, the kind of validation that doesn't need words. I watched Blythe press her lips together and look away. I watched Fitz, my husband, the man I'd built a life with, the man who had held me while I sobbed through those miscarriages, the man who had stood next to me in a DHS office and said, "Yes, she's our daughter." I watched Fitz stare at his glass of bourbon and say absolutely nothing. I picked Zara up. She didn't fully understand what had happened. She was 2. She just knew something felt wrong, and she tucked her head against my neck the way she did when she was tired or scared. I felt her little heart beating fast against my chest. I walked out of that party. I strapped her into her car seat. I drove home. I gave her a bath and sang to her and got her to sleep, and then I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I thought I might actually break apart. And then I stopped crying, and I started planning. Because here is the thing about me that Paulette Graves in her whole manicured, monogrammed world never bothered to learn. I am not a woman who falls apart for long. I am a woman who falls apart privately, processes the damage, and then gets strategic. 9 years at Hollowell and Reed had taught me that the person who controls information controls everything. I had spent my entire career learning how to find what people didn't want found. I started with Fitz. I'd been half ignoring the signs for over a year. The late nights, the cologne he wore only when he wasn't coming straight home, the way his phone was suddenly always face down on every surface. I'd been ignoring it because confronting it meant confronting the possibility that the life I'd built was a construction, and I wasn't ready to do that. But after the party, I was ready. I hired a private investigator named Dolores Webb, a 60-year-old Black woman out of Decatur who had done PI work for half of Atlanta's top law firms, and who was so quietly brilliant she made me want to be better at my job. Dolores had results for me within 3 weeks. Fitz had been having an affair for 2 years. Her name was Sable Fontaine, 28, worked at one of Fitz's tech firm's partner companies, and had been receiving regular wire transfers into an account that, on paper, was tied to a consulting arrangement. The consulting arrangement was fiction. The wire transfers were not. Here is the part that sealed Fitz's fate in my mind. The affair had started 4 months before we adopted Zara. He had known. He had let me go through the adoption process, the home studies, the background checks, the sleepless anticipation, the loss and love and terror of it, while he was building a parallel life with someone else. He had let me fall completely in love with my daughter and then stood in a country club backyard and said nothing while she was humiliated. He had used Zara's adoption as cover. A man with a new baby doesn't look like a man in an affair. It was, if I'm being honest about the pure cold calculus of it, brilliant. It was also the cruelest thing anyone has ever done to me. But it was also, and this is the part where the story changes, a mistake. Because in trying to use me, Fitz had given me leverage he didn't know existed. The consulting arrangement with Sable Fontaine ran through one of Fitz's subsidiary companies. That subsidiary had government contracts. Those government contracts had conflict of interest disclosure requirements. The wire transfers, which Dolores had traced with the patience of someone who had done this for 30 years, constituted undisclosed compensation to a contractor employee who had direct involvement in a bid evaluation process. That is not just adultery. That is federal fraud exposure. I did not go to Fitz with this. I went to my attorney, a woman named Constance Okafor, who had been one of my mentors at Hollowell and Reed before she left to start her own boutique firm, and who had the kind of quiet, lethal competence that made opposing counsel visibly nervous. I laid everything on Constance's desk. The PI report, the bank records Dolores had legally obtained, the contract documents I'd had a colleague verify, the timeline. Constance looked at all of it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "You sure?" she said. "I've been sure since a 7-year-old told my daughter she didn't belong," I said. Constance nodded once. "Okay, then." But I wasn't done building my case, because Fitz was one thread. The Graves family was the whole fabric, and I wanted the fabric. Paulette Graves, matriarch, keeper of the old money and old attitudes, had for decades positioned herself as a philanthropist. The Graves Family Foundation donated to arts education, to historic preservation, to scholarship funds for underprivileged youth, the last of which I found particularly rich given what I now knew. The Foundation's 990s, which are public record, told an interesting story when you read them carefully alongside the property records Dolores had pulled for me. The Foundation owned several properties that were also legally owned by a Graves Family LLC. The Foundation was paying management fees to that LLC, an LLC that had no discernible employees and that shared an address with Paulette's personal estate. It was, put plainly, a family slush fund disguised as charity. Blythe, who presented herself as simply a devoted mother and society wife, turned out to have a more complicated financial life. Her husband, Randall Pryor, had, through a series of shell company transactions that took even Dolores 3 weeks to fully map, structured a real estate deal that used foundation funds as bridge financing without board disclosure. It was, in a word, fraud. A quieter word for it, the kind that gets settled rather than prosecuted if you're careful and fast and have excellent lawyers, but fraud nonetheless. I had the whole picture now. I had Fitz's federal exposure, I had Paulette's foundation irregularities, I had Randall and Blythe's real estate fraud. I had, in Constance's words, enough to make every one of them sweat through their Hermes. I also had something none of them saw coming. I had documentation that Paulette had on 3 separate occasions made cash gifts to Fitz that were structured just below the federal gift tax reporting threshold. Given the timing of those gifts relative to the Foundation's fiscal year, they constituted further evidence of personal benefit from Foundation funds. Paulette had essentially been using donor money to supplement her own family's lifestyle, her son's lifestyle, for years. I spent 2 months building this, quietly, going to work every day, coming home, putting Zara to bed, kissing Fitz on the cheek like everything was fine. He suspected nothing. Why would he? In his world, women like me didn't play this kind of long game. In his world, women like me were grateful. In his world, I was lucky to be there. That assumption was the most expensive mistake of his life. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in March. I did not warn him. Constance's firm served him at his office, his actual office, in front of his assistant and 2 of his senior managers, because I am meticulous and I believe in witnesses. The filing included a detailed exhibit attached to the asset disclosure request that referenced by name and account number the consulting arrangement with Sable Fontaine and flagged it as a matter that my legal team was simultaneously referring to the relevant federal oversight office for review. He called me 16 times before noon. I didn't answer once. I was sitting in a park in Buckhead with Zara, who was eating goldfish crackers and trying to make friends with a pigeon, completely unconcerned with the demolition I was conducting from a bench 3 miles away. Fitz's attorney, a very expensive man named Greer Dalton, who had handled the Graves family's legal matters for 15 years, called Constance that afternoon. Constance told me later that Greer sounded like a man who had been caught in traffic and was only now realizing the plane had already left. We negotiated for 3 weeks. The terms I received were as follows: the Dunwoody house, which I had already decided to sell, a cash settlement that represented approximately 30% of Fitz's personal liquid assets, full sole legal custody of Zara with standard liberal visitation for Fitz, who, whatever else he was, had never been cruel to her directly and whom Zara knew as her father, and a non-disparagement agreement that Fitz signed with notably less pushback than Constance had anticipated, because the alternative involved me allowing the federal referral to become an active investigation rather than a quiet referral that, for now, was simply sitting in someone's inbox. Fitz understood the architecture of what I'd built. To his credit, and I will give him this one small credit, he understood it cleanly. He didn't fight me on the custody. He didn't fight me on the house. I think somewhere in the wreckage of what we'd been, he understood that what had happened at that birthday party was a line I could never uncross, and that no amount of legal maneuvering was going to make me forget what he'd done with his silence. The foundation was a separate matter. I did not go to the press. That was never the plan. The press is a weapon you use when you want spectacle, and I didn't want spectacle. I wanted... I agree, I said. My attorney will be in touch about scheduling. There was a silence, long enough that Zara looked up from the duck and said, "Mama?" Just checking I was still there. "I'm here, baby," I said. I heard something shift in the silence on Paulette's end. I don't know if it was the word baby or the absolute calm in my voice, or simply the realization that she was dealing with a version of me she had never bothered to account for. Whatever it was, when she spoke again, the bedrock was still there, but something else was layered under it, something that, if I hadn't known better, I might have called respect. "Blythe and Randall," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement. "Third-party review will cover all foundation activities," I said. "That's standard." Another silence. "What do you want, Serena?" And here is where I want you to understand something about revenge, the kind that lives in your chest for years, the kind that gets revenge confused with destruction. That kind would have answered that question with a list. Burn it all down, take the money, expose everything, make them small in the way they tried to make my daughter small. But I am not that kind. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was not destruction. It was accountability. It was the world being forced to look at itself clearly and either change or be changed. "The Foundation's scholarship program," I said. "The one for underprivileged youth." Paulette waited. "It's going to be expanded, meaningfully, with real money, real oversight, and a board that includes community representatives from the neighborhoods it's supposed to serve. The management fee arrangement with the family LLC ends. The assets are restructured and properly segregated. An independent board member with charitable governance experience is added, and the foundation's public communications, including Paulette Graves's personal philanthropic profile, are updated to reflect a specific commitment to racial equity in education funding." Silence. "That's all?" Paulette said, and I could hear the disbelief. That and an acknowledgement. Not public, not a press release, just you call your son and you tell him what happened at Cassidy's party was wrong. You tell Blythe. You make sure the message is clear enough that it reaches the children, that it reaches Cassidy. Serena, she's 2 years old, Paulette. My daughter is 2 years old, and she's already learning that rooms don't always want her in them. You don't get to be part of creating that lesson and then act like it didn't happen. The longest silence of all. I watched Zara splash the duck. She had this habit of narrating her games, full conversations between toys, voices and all, like a little showrunner. She was giving the duck a very complicated storyline involving a pirate ship and a lost crown. I could have listened to her forever. "I'll call Fitzgerald," Paulette said, finally. "Good," I said. "And the compliance matter?" "If the restructuring happens as discussed, the review concludes without referral." Paulette made a sigh that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound of a woman who had built her entire life on controlling outcomes and was standing in front of the first outcome she couldn't control. "You're not what I expected," she said. "No," I agreed. "I know." I hung up. Zara looked up at me. "Done?" she said, because she'd noticed I'd put the phone down. "Done," I said. She held the duck out to me. "Now you play," she said. So I sat on the bathroom floor of the house that was soon to be sold, and I played Duck Pirates with my daughter until the water went cold, and she was yawning so hard her whole face crinkled up, and I thought about how the people who tried to make her small had no idea who they were dealing with. Not just me, her, Zara DuPont Graves, who at 2 years old was already narrating her own stories, already making the duck the hero, already deciding how the plot went. I got a text from Fitz in November. Just, "I'm sorry. I should have said something that day. I know it doesn't fix it." It didn't fix it, but it was something. I texted back, "Teach Zara who she is whenever you have her. That's how you fix it." He sent back a thumbs up, and then, a minute later, a heart. I didn't respond to the heart. Some bridges stay down. Blythe reached out in December, through a mutual acquaintance, awkwardly, asking if I'd be open to coffee. I said not yet, maybe someday. I meant it. I don't need Blythe Pryor to be my enemy. I just needed her to understand that her silence had a cost, and that she'd paid it, and that the ledger was now even. Whether she wanted to rebuild something from the rubble was her choice. I made senior partner, at Hollowell and Reed the following spring, youngest in the firm's history. There was a small dinner for it, and I brought Zara, who wore a red dress and charmed every person in the room and climbed onto my chair when I gave my remarks so she could see everyone. My colleague, Darren Vale, who has known me since my second year at the firm, leaned over afterward and said, "She's exactly like you." "God help the world," I said. He laughed. "Exactly." Here is what I want you to take from this, if you take anything. I did not win because I was ruthless. I won because I was patient, because I stayed in the room when every instinct said flee, because I paid attention when everyone assumed I wasn't watching, because I built something out of pain instead of just burning in it. And because I had a 2-year-old who grabbed my thumb with both hands and looked at me like I hung the moon, and I'll be damned if I was going to let a single person in this world make her feel like she didn't belong wherever she chose to stand. They bullied my baby. They stood in their manicured yards with their crystal glasses and their expensive manners, and they looked at my daughter and found her lacking, and they thought, because they always think this, people with that kind of money and that kind of smallness, that the story was already written, that the ending was set, that women like me and daughters like Zara occupied a particular place in their narrative and would stay there. They were wrong. The story was always mine. It still is. And Zara, my brilliant, ridiculous, duck-narrating, crown-finding, fearless daughter, Zara's story is just beginning. God help anyone who tries to write it for her.